Okay, so you've had the more serious chat so far. Quantitative, qualitative, mixed method testing, really important, something you need to be aware of and think about as you put your dissertation together. Duke's last week, which was looking at the idea of research and how you need to put that together and some methods about managing it. I wanted to start a chat about what a lot of students want to do, and then they seem to struggle with sort of understanding how you go about doing it, which is taking a portfolio piece, because that's essentially what most of you, not all of you, but most of you want to try and do, is have something that can go in your portfolio out of this 40 credit module. How do you take a portfolio piece and turn it into a dissertation? So there's kind of the question is it even possible? Short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, with massive caveats. So we're going to have a look at, and we're going to break down what is a portfolio piece in the first place. We're going to break down what is a dissertation and do they actually match up. And then we're going to look at some examples. And one thing that actually I want to sort of delve into is this idea of portfolio first. Have some of you already built a portfolio piece and are now looking to go, how do I make this into a dissertation? Because that's sometimes what happens, is that you get so excited around just building something. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's an artist, whether it's a designer that's want to put something together, whether it's a technical piece or a piece of programming. You've put it together and you now want to say, okay, how do I work backwards? Which you shouldn't really do, but students do. So let's have an honest conversation about how you go about doing that. So first thing is, so almost a question that I want to throw out to you guys. What do you need to demonstrate, regardless of what it is, whether it's an art piece, whether it's a tech piece, whether it's a design piece, you're putting something to go in your portfolio to show to industry. What do you need to demonstrate? What are the core fundamentals? Now, the next slide is I actually asked Mick. He didn't know what I was doing. I just asked him, because he's interviewed people over the years and hired people. I said, what are the core things you're looking for when you're interviewing and you're looking at a portfolio? And we've got a list of those next. So I want to see if you actually know what's industry looking for. Go on.
How you already know to do what they're going to be doing in industry.
So like subject knowledge. Yeah. Do you know the subject? Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah.
Workflow, ability to iterate, and just critical thinking.
Yeah. So like, yeah. Do you know the workflow? Can you do a breakdown of the process? Creative thinking, sort of, is it originality of thought? And iteration, can you show development of it? These are all things that Mick said. Yeah. Anything else?
That's a dedication of time to a piece, because if you're willing to put in the effort, then you're willing to put in effort in the workplace as well.
Yeah, so like sort of completion, quality of the completion. How have you put that finishing touch to it? Have you pushed it all the way to the end? Yeah. Taste. What do you mean by taste?
You might, regardless of what sort of like art style it is, it still needs to look good for what it is.
Oh, okay. So can you essentially, is it up to a standard, sort of a standard bar, regardless of what it is?
Yeah, that's sort of.
Okay. What's that? Teamworking ability. In a portfolio, potentially if you're showing off like a game you've made, you're going to say this is my contribution to that game, and you can actually break that down. Yeah, like potentially. Darryl had his hand up.
Well, I didn't look at your slides like I said I was going to do, so I'm going to say the key thing for me is always, can you actually work to a deadline, and how fast are you? Because time is money. Key thing in a studio is that, you know, we're paying you to do this work, are you going to do the work on time?
That is another one actually that is interesting, because what a lot of people don't do is put how long a piece, like if you're on ArtStation and you have a look and you see this amazing piece, very rarely does it say how long they've spent making it. Is it a day or is it a year? But for a graduate position, it's really important for employers to know how long you've spent on something. And it's one of the reasons why, if you've taken Advanced 3D or Advanced Viz, you've got essentially 6 to 9 weeks. Well, if you did it in that time frame and it's complete, ready to go on a portfolio, you're right, I did it in 6 weeks. Because that's a really good metric. So most of these is what you've said already. Breakdowns of development, workflows, a solid understanding of the subject matter, demonstration of technical ability, showcase of iteration, the evolution of the project, the evolution of your thought process, creativity, originality of thought, the ability to problem solve. That's one thing that, again, is probably for me one of the most important things in game dev, is that most of your time is spent problem solving. It's not making something really cool, it's going, oh, how do I solve this one problem? So can you demo that? Consistency of quality, which is kind of what you said, on that. And then references. Where is this idea come from? Are you following a concept? Is the concept your own? Have you got your demonstration of where your ideas are coming from? Where if it's a character and you're doing a particular sort of sculptural, where's that reference coming on? You should be showing that in sort of some kind of development log, whether it's a sketchbook that you're going to upload separately, whether it's a blog that's going to tie in with the piece. All of these things are really important, and this is regardless of the subject. So whether it's art, character, environment, vehicle, prop, whether it's design, whether it's technology, it's a programming piece, you should be trying to answer all of these sort of key fundamentals when putting a portfolio piece together. Now with that in mind, what is a dissertation when you break it down? So tell me what a dissertation is. In your view, your eyes, when we say write a dissertation, what is it?
Research paper.
A research paper. Okay? It's quite simpler. What? Anyone? A big essay. When you put it into the dictionary, that's what you get. A long essay on a particular subject. Yeah, long essay. That's all it is. You're writing about a specific thing. Now, what does that mean in terms of the learning outcome? So what are you needing to show in that big essay? The same way that we've just broken down a portfolio, what are the core things that you need to show in a portfolio piece? What are the core things you need to show in a dissertation? Technical understanding.
Everything that's in the assessment criteria.
So everything's in the assessment criteria. So what, if you've read the assessment criteria, what's in the assessment criteria?
Stuff like Plessy.
So what is Plessy actually sort of evaluating?
We went over this yesterday and that was something from that.
I was just telling you we went through this yesterday. Let's see if you can remember. What does Plessy stand for?
Professional.
No,
Something along those letters.
it wasn't professional.
Was it not?
Political.
Political, yeah. Political. L is legal. E is ethical. Then it's social, and I is Nile.
There's no A.
There's no I. There was no I's.
Are we only in classes here?
Oh yeah. What's the last letter?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, yeah, there isn't that. Of course there is. Yeah. What am I
Pless.
talking about? Carry on.
Yeah. Political, social, ethical,
Legal.
legal.
Who got the I?
The I is like issues for all, like political issues.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is that? What is that evaluating?
So it's basically issues that could come up with the top, your chosen topic area.
So how does your subject area fit within the bigger picture?
Yeah.
So how does yours fit in with the whole idea of whatever your subject area is? Okay. So what else does a dissertation look for? What are you trying to evaluate? Problem solving ability.
Isn't it just a slide which you showed us like before? Isn't that what-
It is. Every single one of these is the exact same thing that's in there, different order. That is the point, is that the things you need to demonstrate in a portfolio are the exact same things you need to demonstrate in a dissertation. There's only one major difference between the two. What is that?
One of them's fun.
One of them is an essay, one of them is not. That is the only difference. You're writing up this lot, whereas in the other format, you're just showcasing it. We have to write up all of these things and put it in an academic context. So, with that in mind, I'm going to jump into some examples of students that took this approach of trying to think of a portfolio question first and then work around it. But is there anyone currently in the position where they've kind of got a portfolio piece already, or they're working on it, but they don't really have the other stuff, the research, the process, the technical underpinnings that go along with it? Okay, so that's fine. We just need to actually think about how we're going to approach it. There's a few do's and don'ts here. One of these, like, at the end of this process, don't try and just make it up and say, but like, fudge the fact that you did the research first and then you built something. Kind of that hardly ever works successfully. What you want to be doing is trying to go through everything that Duke and Darryl has already talked about, but put it into context of what you've built already. So one of the examples here is that to make a defense of what you've used. So if you've built something, you've built a character, you've built a technical piece, you've probably used a piece of software, you've used a workflow that you already know. Well, that's a defense of why you've chosen that workflow, is that it was already familiar to you, so you've actually utilized that familiarity to build the thing, instead of going off and saying, okay, well, let's start with research. What should the workflow be? What does the research entail? What is the industry standard processes? And then doing that way, you've done what you already know, and now you need to say, okay, well, that is how I've approached it to actually avoid any conflict with speed, process, stuff like that. So if you're trying to evaluate, I don't know, if an art style is more efficient, or a tool is more efficient to use in a particular workflow, you've said, okay, well, I'll use this one because I'm more efficient with it. That already brings in that sort of process.
Can I expand a little?
Yes, of course I can.
Just a tiny bit, and this comes to what is the emphasis of the dissertation. So as Matt's saying, you know, if you already know a workflow, let's say you were testing, you were comparing art styles, and you already knew, let's say, Blender, but in order to, you know, so it doesn't matter about the software, it matters about the end result, the style. So whether you use Blender Max or Maya or whatever to get to the end, to compare the styles doesn't matter. So if your defense could be actually, okay, let's say you're doing cloth, so Marvelous would be the most obvious one. But you already knew you have to do cloth in ZBrush, so you did it in ZBrush. That's fine. You could say in your dissertation, you know, that Marvelous exists and it's fantastic, but that's not the point of my dissertation. The point is to compare like, these clothing items. So I did it in ZBrush because I already know that, because I've just got it out of the way so that I could get onto the meat and potatoes of the dissertation. So I think that's that about not, you know, yes, the research may have suggested Marvelous was better. You don't have time to learn Marvelous and then do your dissertation. Does that make sense? So your defense is, I already know that bit, and that's not the point of my dissertation. So I'm just doing it and got it out of the way.
So we're going to go through some examples of students that have done this. And I want you to think about these key criteria as we go through. Because every single one of them are sort of answering these key problems. So the first one I want to show is Joe. So some of you have probably already seen his dissertation. I give it out to mine as an example piece. But for each one of these examples, I've written essentially what they wanted out of the dissertation, what they wanted out of a portfolio piece. So for Joe, he wanted to get better at lighting. He acknowledged that he was aiming at the time to be an environment artist, and he was pretty confident in his ability to texture and his ability to model. But what he wasn't great at the time was his lighting in Engine. So that's what he wanted to work on in order to improve his portfolio to demonstrate that. So this is one of the final products he came up with, was this small scene that was lit in different ways. And let me just pull up his ArtStation for it. And it went into his portfolio as a portfolio piece. And so just put Joe's, which is here. But you'll notice that his title for this is tutorial, written up. Because one of the questions that you always have to answer is, what is your question at the beginning? What are you trying to solve? What is the problem on a dissertation that you're trying to answer? And for him it was to improve my knowledge of lighting. So how do you then evaluate whether what he has done is good enough? What he has done is actually the right process. And so we chatted around for a while about what he wanted out of it. And it boiled down to, okay, the type of thing that Darryl was talking about a few weeks ago is, how do you test whether the thing that you have made is relevant or not to your question? And so we said, well, let's build a tutorial. Let's demonstrate your understanding of this field now by passing that knowledge on to others. And you can then evaluate whether it was successful or not by whether those people learnt about lighting the same way that you wanted to. You have taken that research, he went away, he researched the subject area, his lit review, lighting in Engine. He built a product that demonstrated his understanding of that research, and then he passed that knowledge on to others, so he could then evaluate and test whether it was successful or not. And you can go off and you can see here, this is his portfolio piece that directly links in the Read More section to blog posts, part 1 and part 2, that break it down in a nice, detailed, understandable way for a beginner, a new person to come into this and learn from Joe. So this was a great portfolio piece for him because it answered multiple requirements for him. It answered that question of everything that you need to answer in a dissertation, but it also showcased to an employer that he knows his subject area inside and out. He can pass on knowledge to others effectively. And in Rebellion now, he's over at Rebellion, he's a very valuable member of the team. Weirdly, he's moved away from lighting and environment and he's gone fully into texture pipelines, but that was something that he did once he got to Rebellion. But inside his dissertation, I'm just going to switch over. Throughout his report, he is showcasing not only his research into the different fields, different things that apply to his particular area, which was lighting, but also showcases his experiments as well. So it wasn't just about a final piece. These, all the way through it, is showing his little experiments, his little lighting tests to learn and showcase at each phase what he's doing. So throughout it, this can also go into his portfolio if he wishes. It shows experimentation. It shows that iteration of thought. And you can see here all these different experimentations of mood, lighting, temperature, warmth, composition having a massive impact in how you view things. All designed around answering that one question that he wanted to do: get better at lighting. And you'll see a pattern as we go through this. So Chris was Duke was his supervisor,
Yeah, we can talk about it.
You can do if you wish, yeah.
So, Chris wanted to, you know the Marmoset viewer, the really cut down minimal one that doesn't have any features. He liked that, and he also liked, but it didn't represent the end result in Unreal as well as just putting it in Unreal. So he wanted to make an Unreal model viewer along the lines of the Marmoset viewer. So he wanted to understand like how you render just albedo, wireframe, AO maps within. So that was his kind of goal. And he wanted to make this little boat. So his kind of his project is an executable that runs. It's an Unreal package executable, which you can then model view this small scene. And he wanted to understand, because he had to, in an executable you can't turn on the debug modes by default. You can't, like turn on wireframe and everything else. Not wireframe, I can't remember all the ones he did, AO and stuff like that. So he had to write a lot of these systems himself, which is kind of part of the way of getting there. I think it's left mouse to look around, and then press F to bring up the thing. Or is it?
I also think this machine might not have a dedicated graphics card because that water is not rendering.
Okay, you can't really see it, but there is an
But you can toggle between.
Oh, you toggle between modes, okay. So these modes were all done by Chris, and really, at the end of the day, it's that boat that kind of came out of it. The boat was the portfolio piece, and then it was like, well, how do I learn? What do I learn through this? And yeah, so that's the gorgeous boat at the end. But it was a model viewer for a boat, and then it was like, well, I need some water because I need the transparency. And actually, there's a key compressor makes the boat bounce to buoyancy. And then it was, well, I might as well add a tree, and then that hanging aircraft thing. There's a spotlight on the boat that shines on that, so we needed that in order to demonstrate the way that lighting interacts. So you kind of had to add all these features, even though it's just about the boat. You had to add all these features in order to make it interesting. And that led him down a path, so his dissertation was all about like rendering technologies and how they've all come about over the years. Not to the level the programmers do. The programmers actually write the maths of the rendering. He was still implementing existing rendering technologies, but there was a big focus on it. I don't look too closely because it wasn't the best dissertation. It was very much a rushed piece at the end, but there's a lot of discussion about rendering.
But yeah, I think what Chris wanted, if we break it down to what did he want, he wanted to demonstrate his understanding of rendering, understanding of pipelines. And you've probably seen this in his other work that we've demoed, his advanced viz work, the waterfall scene that you might have, hopefully you looked through his sketchbook because it was one of the example ones, is that it was all about that technical underpinning behind that. How do you make the optimization for the rocks? How do you make the optimization for the foliage? That's the route Chris was going. He really enjoyed that idea of building scenes but building them optimal. And to take that to the next level, he wanted to look further into rendering and rendering passes and how do you control those, how do you understand them. So that's what his entire dissertation was about, really, was understanding rendering. And as part of that, he got a portfolio piece that he could demonstrate the quality of his rendering ability. And then Duke's dad joke, he pushed the boat out on that asset. Lewis is another really interesting one, because what Lewis wanted to do was learn a new piece of software, which at first glance you're going, well, how is that a dissertation? Learning a new piece of software. So he really enjoyed always sculpting clothing. So when he ever did a character, the character underneath was the least interesting bit to him. It was the clothing on top. He was always modeling like Nike shoes and things like that, trainers. So he wanted to say, okay, well, I already use ZBrush a lot. I know that pipeline for making clothes, but in industry they use Marvelous Designer a lot. So I'm going to have to learn that if I want to get into that field. So can I turn that into a dissertation? The answer is yes, but if you approach it in the right way. So one of the things that he started to focus on at the beginning was comparing Marvelous Designer workflow to ZBrush workflow for making clothes. And we very quickly got to the question of, well, how are you going to test that? How are you going to say whether that is better than that? And he went, well, I'll build the same thing twice in 2 different software, and I'll say, I'll time it, and I'll work out which is more efficient and which is better. And I went, but you're not a master of Marvelous Designer, and you're not a master of ZBrush, so how can you, as an individual, say which is better? So the answer is you can't. And maybe some of you have run into that exact problem of you're not in a position to actually say with any certainty which is which. So you need to look at it a different way. You can either go down the route of proving it through research, proving it through questionnaire, like as Darryl said, quantitative, qualitative approach to that testing methodology. How are you getting that data to answer it? Or the way that Lewis approached it was actually to ask a different question. It was, if I already know ZBrush, how do I incorporate Marvelous into that? How do I make Marvelous part of that process? And that's where the question came from. How do you actually incorporate a new tool into an already existing pipeline? So part of his pipeline, if I just jump over to Lewis's, was essentially very similar to Joe. He built a workflow guide, essentially. After doing all his research into different types of fabric, the way that industry use it, the way that fabric is utilized in games, in cinema, for high-end production, things like that, how it's done in real time, how it's done in pre-rendered. He then started to delve into, okay, well, if you're going to go down the route of Marvelous, you have to really know fabric patterns. And you have to be a clothing designer, really, because you need to know how to build it. So he went down that route of researching how to understand fabric patterns, how to understand workflows, how to utilize that software in order to do something as complex as this. This is the piece that he picked. And he deliberately picked this one because it's lots of different fabric materials all interacting with each other. They're folding over, they're being tied together, you've got these interesting creases. And actually to build that in ZBrush, anyone has ever attempted to do that type of stuff, that's really hard to actually do. So actually he said, okay, how can we incorporate Marvelous into that? So he built this little guide, this little blog post as his output, which is essentially demonstrating how you go about it, what you need to think about at each stage, what you need to actually, how you need to go about incorporating that workflow all the way through, ready to put it into ZBrush. Because that was the key thing. He already knew ZBrush. Where does Marvelous stop? Where does ZBrush begin? So that was his output. And it's a great portfolio piece because it demonstrates a very complex piece of work in a tool that's industry standard, and he's broken it down into some complexity. And now all he needed to do, if he wanted to make that into a fully finished portfolio piece, is to do the ZBrush work on top of it. Kyle. Kyle was an interesting one because Kyle already had a job in the games industry. He was already working for Sumo in final year. But he acknowledged that the weakest part of his character production pipeline was hair. And if you ever look at his portfolio, essentially all of the characters that he did up until the point he did this dissertation always had basic sculpted hair, and that was it. He never went to that next level and did fully polygonal hair card hair. And so that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to get better at it because he acknowledged that was the weakness in his portfolio. So he did. He went off, researched industry standard approaches to hair, and he built an example that could go in his portfolio to demonstrate how hair is built in real time. Not only hair, but beards, eyebrows, eyelashes, all the things that are needed for hair. And he tested that. And he tested that by interviewing his teammates at Sumo. So straight away, his testing approach is validated because it's A, the question is, have I made hair to an industry standard pipeline workflow correctly, yes or no? Industry have said yes or no in his interview. It's a nice, easy thing to do. Now you might think, well, I don't have access to a studio to ask them that. Well, Helen, who Daryl supervised, is a really good example. I actually removed Helen's as an example because, but she didn't work in industry, but she basically reached out to people on Twitter, ArtStation, LinkedIn, and got them to answer the question. And so she went down a very similar route to Kyle. Kyle had access to it, she didn't. She reached out. So her dissertation got really high grades for that portion of it straight away because she reached out. And if you're in a similar boat, you should be doing that as well. You should be trying to reach out to industry. If someone's in a community, they will usually help if they can. Melissa was an interesting one. Because Melissa did what a lot of you do as artists. And is anyone doing this exact dissertation right now where you're comparing art styles? No one in the room. Usually that's like go-to for artists, is to say you want to compare A to B. How do you make a realistic thing and how do you make a stylized thing? So she wanted to test her knowledge of art styles. So could she go into a studio? At the time she was wanting to go back to, she had a placement at Red Kite and she wanted to go back there. Red Kite do all sorts of different work, so her ability to jump from art style to art style is really important. She wanted to understand, can she develop that? Does she know the pipeline to do a stylized piece, a cel-shaded piece, a hand-painted piece, PBR realistic piece? So she built them. That was what she spent most of her dissertation doing, is building this sword 3 times over and over again in different styles. But throughout our conversations, we had a secondary goal, is that she had high hope one day to move into more of an art lead position. Now, Duke and Daryl will corroborate the fact that Melissa was not the loudest of people. She was a very quiet little meek person. When you stood next to her, you're like, I still can't hear you. But she wanted that role eventually of being in a lead. So we said, well, to be in a lead position, you need to demonstrate, understand, you need to know everything about the workflow. You need to know everything about what people need to do at a particular moment, and you need to manage that. So she built as her method of testing these 3 pieces that she did. A flow diagram, which is a really unique way of testing. Essentially, she said, if I could go into a studio and I had a team of artists that I have then just said, we're now going to do a realistic style, we're now going to do a cel-shaded style, we're now going to do a hand-painted style, I need to inform to them the exact pipeline and workflow that we're going to use. How do I know what is the right pipeline and workflow without doing it myself, without testing it? So throughout building those 3 pieces, this flow diagram was an ever-evolving thing. It would constantly be updated, and she would send it off to people in industry that she made contact with and ask them to evaluate whether this pipeline was effective for a studio environment. And that's her testing, is that questionnaire, and it's the ever-evolving questionnaire. She sent it out multiple times, got multiple rounds of comments, that then she could go back and iterate on it all the way up to, she then made an interactive one, which essentially was a PowerPoint with clickable buttons that took you to PowerPoint slides. Not the most complex of things, but it allowed her to actually demonstrate with very clear objective of saying, do I know the workflow of these assets that I've built as a portfolio piece? The answer was yes, she does. She's proven it with that testing approach. So, in a nutshell, you can see there's just a couple of examples. Every single one of them started with, I want to do X. And all of them were, I want to do X to improve my portfolio. None of them were, I want to do X because I want to go onto a master's and a PhD and I want to answer a research question. It was, I want to do this portfolio thing, and then through collaboration and discussion with the supervisor, which is why it's really important to talk to your supervisor at every stage, is that each one of them evolved into being what it ended up being, and all of them did really well on their dissertation. Even though none of them start off with, let me answer this research question. So, in terms of portfolio first, all of them were portfolio first because that's all they wanted to do in their mindset, and they worked backwards. So if you're in a similar position where you know what you need to do, what you want in a portfolio, that's what you need to do. You now need to work through that question, through that want, to an output at the end that will not only answer the question of dissertation, but also answer the question of portfolio, and can you have both, essentially. I think the last slide I ended up just leaving as a joke, as a comment. What to think about. Thinking is hard. In a nutshell, the reason why this sort of like thought process was there is that, and I think Duke told me to say this, was in student panel, sort of one of the comments that came back was that students felt like it's too late. We didn't do anything the whole of semester one. We don't have enough time now to fix that. We've basically failed our dissertation. The answer is, there is more than enough time if you approach it in the right way. And that approach is, ask what your question is, what do you want to answer, whether from a research point of view or whether from a portfolio point of view, and just work through it. The portfolio itself, the product, in order to make that product, I guarantee you will already have done the research, because there's no way you've done a product to a high standard without doing it. So all you now need to do is write it up in a logical way that tells a story. So that is why thinking is hard, is that you've got to think up, what do you want? So actually, because we've got a few more minutes left, we've got quite a bit of time left, I actually want to just throw it out to you guys, and we're going to do that thing of, what do you want? And can you, on the spot, come up with a workflow that actually comes up with, how do you show off that portfolio piece of the dissertation? Because this is what I do at the beginning with all my supervisees. I ask them, what do you want? What do you find fun? What do you want to do? My question isn't what piece of research you're going to do, it's what do you want? So is anyone in that situation right now that they're going, I've got a product, I've got a thing I wanted to do, but I don't know how to turn that into a dissertation? All good?
Everybody? Go on. It's a safe place to do it.
It's the time to do it.
And you'll have all these people to throw their brains at your idea.
Yeah?
Seminar style. Anybody want to volunteer their portfolio? I'm looking at random Nick because you kind of had that at the beginning when Matt said, you don't have to, but when Matt said, is anyone in this position? Your hand kind of floated a little bit.
I haven't got an idea of how to do it. What I don't know right now is how to test it, because I'm talking about like character design, like all the features, like aspects of character design.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the way I would do it is research how to
Okay. So let's go back to that question of what are you want out of building this? So I'm going to presume that you're 3D modeling a character based on someone else's concept for your portfolio piece. So essentially what you did for Advanced 3D and what you did for Viz. What are you wanting out of that at the back end of it?
Originally, I built it for my portfolio because I wanted to showcase a different art style, but also different proportions
Okay.
of the character.
So what is the art style that you wanted to demonstrate?
Stylized, kind of like chibi.
So super stylized, super cartoony, chibi-esque. Okay. And then I presume you said proportion. So what comes with that is anatomical dysmorphism of creating a character that has very distorted proportions without making them look weird, without making them look okay. Okay, so that's a super interesting one because that's essentially you're looking at design principles of characters. So looking at shape language. So the very obvious sort of base level example of that is rounded shapes emote friendliness, pointed harsh shapes are harsh and angry and almost like associated with enemies. So you then go through, you go, well, I'm building this thing based on shape language, understanding of anatomy as well. So what you're wanting to test at the end of that essentially is, have you met the art style criteria as well as met the communication of character design principles? So shape language, anatomical principles, communication of those criteria. So how
But it feels like I can build it off these language of shapes and everything, but if I'm modeling it off someone else's concept, then I would have to go with what their idea of this character is. And I would know that unless I don't know, I have to ask them.
Okay. So let's look at it from a different point of view. What techniques did you need to do differently to model this than you would a realistic character? So because if you're doing a realistic character, it's all sculptural, it's base shapes first, anatomical understanding, building those structures. When you're doing something like a chibi, you don't start with those, do you? Yeah, so you could look at it from a workflow perspective and say what changes in the way that an artist needs to approach a workflow to do this style. Stu was going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask, what is it you want to test in the sense of, are you testing a successful transition from concept to 3D model, or are you testing the method that you followed? Are you testing the software approach? What is it that you are interested in order to prove that it was a success? What's your metric of success?
Well, really, my dissertation is based off like different designs, how you design a character from like the silhouettes to tying it into like narrative and everything. But I wanted to tie in this portfolio piece, so it's just anyhow I would tie it in, and I think that the best way to do it is to look into the proportions and how to transfer that from 2D to 3D.
So what if you were then to say, if it's about like narratives, just I don't know the character or anything, but what if, as a suggestion, you were to show everybody the concept and ask them to describe that concept using 5 keywords? So it might be things like friendly or scary or whatever, I don't know, completely random. And then you ask a whole load of different people, they can't be the same people, to use 5 words to describe your 3D model. And then look for similarities and also for those ones where it's really, if somebody says scary and somebody says friendly, and you're like, well, what's gone wrong? What is it about? And then you could always, potentially depending on the number of people, you could maybe capture those 2 people that have given you quite different non-standard results, and then interview them and say, what was it that was scary? And the other person, what was it? What made you think friendly? Why? And you could maybe then delve that might be a route into testing the success of a 2D to 3D transfer. Because if your concept is all round shapes and you start adding spikes on, and obviously changes the perception, which changes the underlying narrative of the character, that could be a way of diving down into that.
That's what we like.
So there's a slight disconnect between your research and your portfolio piece, because your research, by the sounds of it, is all character design, and then for the portfolio piece, you haven't designed. You've taken someone else's, so you're not actually going to be ever going to really be demonstrating that portion of the research, because you've already taken the design anyway. So I think that is interesting, Duke, is that looking at it from a slightly different angle and saying, if your research is all around character design and character process, coming up with the character, and then you're starting with an already existing one.
I think it still work. So if you say, for example, the round shapes create friendliness,
Yeah.
and then you find a concept that is round to then build and then ask people what they think and they say friendly, I think that kind of completes the
Yeah.
loop. It's not, given more time, you would design your own based on the research.
Yeah.
But if you can find a concept that still matches the research, as close to the research, I think that's an okay.
Is the concept a 2D concept or a 3D concept?
It's a 2D concept.
Okay, so that's another thing. How do you then take a 2D concept of a character design and translate that same design into 3D? Because you've now got to actually look and analyze what was the original artist trying to communicate with the 2D elements, and how do you translate that into 3D? Because that then, and you can do the same sort of method of testing, is that you're still looking, have I hit all of the criteria that was being communicated in the 2D concept? Have I got the same criteria in the 3D concept? You're just putting a slightly different spin on that same
I think that's
process.
where the word cloud scenario
Yeah.
would come up. So you'd look for, so if they were coming, all the 3D ones were coming out scary, let's say,
Yeah.
all your 2D ones were coming out friendly, you would say, well, something's gone wrong in my translation. What is it? Where? And then you would go and interview and try and dig deep, or focus group maybe, get a few people together who were thinking the scary option. You say, well, I was going for friendly. How have I missed the boat? What is it? Colours? Is it, like long skirts, long limbs? I guess are more
Was it, yeah,
scary.
because if you're doing a translation from 2D to 3D, have you put the right proportionality into the 3D-ness of it or not? Is it like squashed? Is it distorted? Is it too sharp of an angle? You can actually look at all those type of things. So yeah, that could be an approach which quite allows you to actually do exactly what you want in terms of a portfolio, and yet asks quite an interesting question. Can you translate the design characteristics from 2D to 3D in an appropriate manner? Which, from a portfolio point of view as well, is really important. You're going to be given a concept, can you translate it?
I also think, given time, there'd be possibly an interesting difference between artists looking at your characters and non-artists, so actually your game, just general public. Because they wouldn't necessarily, like Matt would look for a round shape and his brain would go friendly because of the training potentially, whereas my mum would, she doesn't know knowledge of this at all. So other people outside of the game design sphere, but still gamers and maybe, how would they perceive it? Now, all of a sudden we're starting to get to massive numbers, because you need to compare within the designer community or art community, then you need to design outside, then you might get, you get a gender split, you get an age split, you get too many variables, so I think you'd have to reduce the scope to what's the most interesting to me at this point. Otherwise, with too many variables, you lose, the data just gets lost, and you end up where you're not really certain what bits are conflicting with each other. Was it about their age, or was it about their gender, was it about their experience? And why have they made that choice? It becomes too complicated. So, trying to keep it simple.
Okay, so essentially, hopefully what you took away from that is you can do a dissertation by thinking in portfolio first. You just need to think through the story of those key points that Duke spoke about last week, which is, have you got a question that is going to be researched into You're then going to build a product, which you hopefully probably already have if you've done portfolio first. It's going to demonstrate that research. Are you going to do some kind of testing to prove that your product is answering the research that you looked into, and then evaluating it at the end whether it was successful or not? Any general questions? Yes.
What's the terminology for not using the same participants again, like only using them once? What's
I don't know what the term was. I'd say a good idea. I guess you're bringing in potential buyers, aren't you? So if you show them one thing first, like the 2D one, and then they give you their thoughts on the 2D one, and then they see the 3D one, they have prior knowledge of what that 3D character used to look like in 2D, and they're influenced by those previous thoughts.
Yeah, I was thinking as well from mine with like the iterative development cycle, which I'm doing, like if the participant is coming back in again and again, and I'm saying, oh, I've changed the game, they might just anticipate improvement, and that might affect.
That's okay. I think it depends on what your goal is. So in some situations you want iteration because you need them to be contributing, feeding back, and you end up they become part of the iterative cycle on purpose.
Yeah, but the thing is that they might just assume that it's better
Oh yeah.
because of the
Yeah.
iteration, but it might not be.
Don't know what that means. Maybe for maybe one of your iterations you don't change them. And you see what they say. That could be an interesting little.
Turn it off.
The other thing you can do is if you've got limited numbers, you can always do the
Did that just take everything, or was that just?
and then the other half
That
is
took
going to be
everything.
done to the. But it's really hard to tear apart the
Turn it off.
data and figure
I
out
do.
what was
I switched
Yeah,
to.
that was off. Yeah, I tried that
prior
before.
knowledge versus fresh thoughts. So if you can get the numbers, I'd keep them separate.
Yeah, can I turn it off?
There are
You
risks,
need to stop.
for example, having all artists in one group and all in the other group.